Time. My name is Bob Obana, and I'm the Executive Director of the Veterans Health Research Institute, otherwise some known as NCIRE, which is the Northern California Institute for Research and Education. And welcome to our 6th annual event. And this event is a special evening for us because we bring a special group of individuals that have been what we call Friends of Veterans Health Research. And it's a group that have been supporters for us, both in their time, their talent, and obviously with much of their treasure too. And it's been very helpful because as our mission is to advance the health of veterans, we do this through our work in research and supporting and facilitating research at the San Francisco VA healthcare system. And in that role, obviously, the VA cannot do everything, and so it's wonderful to have complementary partners involved in this activity. As some of you know, at the San Francisco VA, it is the largest medical research program in the country dedicated to this type of work to advance the health of veterans. And as such, it's really driven by some fine leaders. And I do want to thank Major General Mike Myatt, who unfortunately can't be here tonight. He's taken away for some other business, but he's represented here by Colonel Starling. Colonel Starling, thank you for the hospitality and making the Marines Memorial available to us. Most people know this, but it is a living memorial. It's a tribute to our service members, and as Bud Buke and many have mentioned, if you've served in the military like these gentlemen and women have, you come here, you feel comfortable. So it's a place that everybody calls home in San Francisco who have served. So thank you very much, Colonel. At this time, I'd like to get our program started and ask our chairman of our board, Dr. Carl Grenfell, to come forward and get us going. Thank you.
Tonight, we will hear from several extraordinary individuals who've served their country in the armed forces and continue to serve our veterans by giving up their time and their resources while either in the private sector or while working directly for the Department of Veterans Affairs. They're here to help improve the future of veterans health care by supporting the Veterans Health Research Institute at NCIRE and to be the beginning of our annual Brain at War conference, where we bring together the greatest minds in the field to work on issues. We're an institute that uses the latest technology to bear on veterans' health, and we do it by intentionally promoting cross-fertilization. We're not a group of siloed researchers in individual departments.
It's really a privilege to honor General Myatt tonight, even though he's not here. Now, if General Myatt knew about this, he probably would have declined anyhow because he's so self-effacing. But we're here, we want to honor General Myatt, recognize and honor a great warrior who most of you know. General Myatt's the president of Marines Memorial Association and our host for the last 7 conferences. Unfortunately, he could not be here tonight. We will arrange for a personal recognition when he gets back. Mike has had a distinguished career in the Marine Corps and in civilian service. A Vietnam veteran and as a general officer in Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, he commanded 22,000 Marines in the 1st Marine Division. In that conflict, his forces defeated 8 Iraqi divisions in zone in Desert Storm, liberating Kuwait City after 96 hours of combat. In 2013, he presented the annual lecture here, which we shall long remember. Let's start with his own words. Quote, "I've worked long hours to commemorate the service and sacrifices of military veterans, educate the public about those sacrifices, and guided the Marines Memorial Club and Hotel to provide services to the currently serving men and women in the U.S. Armed Forces." As a part of his public service, General Myatt is a board member of NCIRE and its Veterans Health Research Institute. Through his leadership, we're able to provide tonight's lecture and tomorrow's conference, which focuses on advancing medical research and clinical care to promote the health of our veterans and their families. When we heard about the inauguration of the Oris Force Recon GMT watch, a number of Mike's friends and watch designer C.C. Wong decided to honor his leadership and his service by presenting him with the very first watch. It is my privilege to introduce C.C. Wong of C.C. Wong Jewelers in Menlo Park, a sponsor of this year's Brain at War conference. C.C.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here tonight. And as an immigrant, when I first arrived to the US, and I have developed a deep appreciation for this country that has offered me and my family. And when I was asked always to design a watch for the Marine Force Recon, I consider it one of the high points of my life as an American. It was, at least, I try to have the American accent, but I've been here 30 years, I'm so sorry. And it was the least I could do to honor our sacrifice of our Marine soldiers, the brave Marines. I worked directly with the 4th Force Recon Marines in the Alameda, and they're based in Alameda. And the Marines, they are amazing. They came to my store and give me the input, the initial input of what they would want as when they're in combat wearing the watch. And after giving the input to me, then I went to Oris, and then Oris designed a custom prototype, which was tested by them in vigorous trainings. And it's my great privilege to present watch number 1 to Major General Mike Myatt, accepting on his behalf General Chris Darling and Michael Allen, Colonel Chris Darling. I practiced it 6 times, I'm sorry. You will be General.
You got promoted.
Yes. And Mr. Mike Allen, the General Manager of Marines Memorial Club and Hotel.
We're also joined in this presentation by Bo, Bubba Jr., and Beulah.
I'm sure General Myatt would very much appreciate this. Thank you.
Cece wanted to more than to just sell these beautiful watches. She wanted to help Marines Memorial Association. So for each watch that's purchased from her, a young Marine will receive a 1-year membership in Marines Memorial Association. Marine veteran Jay Mancini has already purchased watch number 2. Jay, would you come up here, please? We'd like to honor, and here's our real heroes tonight, Sergeant Kyle Garcia and Lance Corporal Brian Vargas. Would you all come up with your families? Both wounded combat veterans, have served our country well, very proud Marines, and they're being given a membership in Marines Memorial Association. Thank you. Cease. Yes.
Sorry to disturb you for a second.
Go ahead.
And the number 3 watch, as a surprise, is present to you.
No, I'm not a Marine.
Yes. Bye.
Thank you.
And it's the idea of?
I can't read that either. I see Brenna and Manaz's name.
Yes.
Thank you.
And Brenna Boja and me.
Okay. Listen, thank you so much, Cece. Let me just thank, we had Ellen Newman in memory of Captain Walter Newman, the Honorable George P. Schultz, John Paulson, Jay Mancini, Mike Fox Sr., Bob Obana, Bob Accardi, John Swenson, Brenna, Michael Fernandez, the Honorable Mike Hanlon, Paul Bud Buca, Vice Admiral Jody Breckenridge, Chris Starling, and C.C. Wong Jewelers. Thank you so much for General Myatt's watch.
And John.
I'd like to thank all the donors. I'd like to thank Bo, Bubba Jr., and Beulah. And thank you for being here.
Those of us, when we found out about the fact that Mr. Collier was actually joining the VA, Department of Veterans Affairs, whereas part of the My VA Task Force, he's the leader of strategic partnership for the secretary. We were delighted. In his short time there, he has also become a wonderful supporter of the San Francisco VA Medical Center and NCIRE. And he is going to be our keynote speaker tomorrow at the Brain at War. I hope many of you will join us for that, and we've asked him to make a few comments tonight. Matt?
So Bob Obama drives a hard bargain. I said, give me some guidance for these remarks. I said, what is this, an hour and 45 minutes? This is 5 minutes or what? He said, I want you to adhere to the 3 B's. I said, you mean the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic? He said, no, the 3 B's, be brief, be kind, and be gone. So I'll be speaking tomorrow for a little longer than I am today. Actually, I'm very honored to be here in this esteemed company. And on behalf of Secretary Bob McDonald and the Department of Veterans Affairs, I want to thank all of you for all you do for veterans. By virtue of your presence here, it's a commitment that we appreciate, Americans appreciate, and thanks again for your presence here. The Brain at War Conference is just a wonderful conference, and I call the UCSF, VA, NCIRE partnership one of the gold standard for academic affiliations, especially with all the research that you do here to benefit veterans, and not only veterans, but Americans across the board. So we appreciate all the work that you do here, and I'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. In November, I was minding my own business. I live in Los Angeles, and as Carl said, I've been in the technology business for the last 20 years, and I got a call from Bob McDonald, and he said, we've got a $169 billion budget. And if you look at the slope of my arm, this is the slope of spending, right? That's the trend. Well, really it ought to be, he explained, it ought to be much higher. So he said, we can't do it alone. We need help. $169 billion is not enough. We need to leverage external resources. We need to do partnerships. And he said, with your background as a veteran, with your background in public service, especially at the community level where most partnerships are made, and with your background in technology on the other side of the coin and in the private sector, perhaps you can help us. And he told me a lot of horror stories about organizations, private companies, public organizations that wanted to work with VA, and the VA had sort of given them the Heisman, we can do it ourselves, we don't need your help. And I want to tell you that attitude is completely gone now. We want to work with partners, we want to collaborate, and the example that you set here, as I said, is a gold standard for us to follow. So we're trying to replicate it across the board. So we've gone from being partnership being a dirty word to something that we're really changing the culture of the Department of Veteran Affairs. So I'm really pleased to be here. I'm honored to be here. I look forward to maybe talking to a few of you tomorrow in the presentation. And thanks again for all you do for veterans. Thanks.
He has been lending his skills, if not leading, much of our effort to build a new campus for the San Francisco VA in Mission Bay, and helping NCIRE and the Veterans Health Research Institute. For that, we thank him. We look forward to working with him, and we welcome you back to the podium, Bud.
First of all, I think someone in the audience needs to be introduced before I do what I was asked to do. We hear a lot about the Department of Veterans Affairs Medical Center at San Francisco. We read about the achievements of the doctors, the research scientists, and a variety of other people involved. We hear very little, and many people do not know, of the person who actually runs that medical center, who overcomes the challenges that an antiquated building, not conforming to seismic codes, not designed to have 1.2 million square feet occupied by doctors, scientists, and all the others, not intended to have to watch out for the life cycle and the concerns of our veterans. We don't hear of that person, and she's here tonight, Miss Bonnie Graham. It's my privilege tonight to introduce our speaker, General George Casey. Anybody who can read the statistics, graduate of Georgetown, 36th Army Chief of Staff, but there are other things that are in other books, and other places that are far more important, in my opinion. Oftentimes, when we hear of a four-star general or generals who lead troops, we conjure up the image of a George Patton, who today, as we look back about it, in one of his more notorious or famous, depending on your perspectives, decided to treat a soldier with PTS by slapping him across the face and calling him a coward. That's one extreme, and it seems to meet the stereotypes that often are wanted for folk legend and myth. But the real generals that this country has produced over time, that have been able to see the country through long wars, are generals that manifest all of the 5 elements of leadership, from integrity, compassion, competence, confidence, and humility. The one that is most important after integrity, because without integrity you have nothing. Without integrity there's no trust, and if no one trusts, no one follows. If no one's following, you're not leading. The most important other ingredient is compassion. And we often wonder, how does a general experience the events that his soldiers and their families will experience? Tonight's speaker, General George Casey, knew personally the greatest cost that this nation demands of its soldiers, Marines, corpsmen, aviators, and sailors. And that is the potential risking of a family member's life for the greater cause. As a young man, George Casey's father was killed in Vietnam. He was a commander of the 1st Cav Division and died in a helicopter crash. So as we look around at our leaders for the longest war that not only served in the Middle East, but served during a very difficult time in how the Army was coming together to meet the demands of the battlefront, we often don't notice that something is written in the document. We don't pause and think. From 2007 to 2011, a general who was asked not only to lead the soldiers in the most trying time of the war, but to lead the United States Army as an institution in a change of administrations, where the public rhetoric was so diverse. One, we're building a bastion of democracy, and the other, we're pulling out. There was an election while he was Chief of Staff for the Army. So tonight we are particularly blessed, and tomorrow more so, that we will be able to reflect on the remarks of a gentleman who wears the rank of 4 stars, but who has learned through his own personal experience that heavy burden when in war we take the life of a family member. Ladies and gentlemen, General George Casey.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. I always get very nervous when I get a standing ovation before I speak. And some of you may have heard this, but every time that happens, I have to tell this joke. And it's probably appropriate here tonight, given the emblem behind me. But there's an Army general, an Air Force pilot, and a Marine sergeant major, and they're all in a prisoner of war camp. And one day the commandant comes in and says, well, I have some bad news, gentlemen, but tomorrow at dawn you're all going to face the firing squad, but I'm here to grant your last request. So he goes up to the major, the pilot, and says, Major, what's your last request? And the pilot throws his scarf over his shoulder and says, I would like to have my last meal by candlelight with a beautiful woman. He says, it will be done. He says, General, what's your last request? The general sucks himself up to his full height of 5'9" and says, I'd like to address the troops one more time. He says, it will be done. And he goes up to the sergeant major and says, Sergeant Major, what's your last request? And the sergeant major says, I want to be shot an hour before the general starts talking. So you've upped the ante here. Buddy, thank you very much. That was a very personal introduction, and I very much appreciate that. Carl, I'd like to get the clip where you said the finest brains in the field are here tonight so I can send it to my mother. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it says up there, but I'm going to focus more on the invisible wounds of war because of the conference tomorrow. And what I'd like to do is give a little context for where we are as a country and where we've come as a military and in dealing with the challenges of traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress. Because I can tell you, I have been, since the time I was the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army in 2003, I've lived that process, to include in retirement, where I really saw for the first time what we were and were not doing for our veterans. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about that tonight. First of all, the context. It may not seem like it to you tonight, but we're in our 15th year at war. 2.5 million men and women have served this country in Iraq and Afghanistan since September 11, 2001. Almost 7,000 have given their lives, leaving some 25,000 surviving family members. Mothers, fathers, spouses, children. I wear this bracelet that was given to me by the spouse of a soldier who was killed in Anbar province during my time in Iraq. She and her 2 children are part of that 25,000. But I wear this to remind me continually of the human cost of war. Over 50,000 have been wounded, some 10,000 of those seriously enough to require long-term care. Over 125,000 have been diagnosed with traumatic brain injury. Fortunately, over 90% of those are mild to moderate. And over 250,000 men and women have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. That's a significant challenge for all of us. The other side of it that I'll just mention briefly is 1.6 million men and women have already left the service. 150,000 of them are unemployed. We can do better than that as a country. Now, the challenge we're going to have is we have to do better in taking care of the men and women who've already borne the burden of the last 14 years at war while we're continuing this struggle. Because we are involved in a long-term ideological struggle against global extremism. Let me put that in perspective for you. This August, the past August, was the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. Last November was the 25th anniversary of the wall coming down. That symbolized the end of the Cold War. The Cold War lasted 45 years. Our ideological struggle against communism lasted 45 years. There's no reason to think this ideological struggle against extremism is going to last any shorter than that. So, in our 15th year, we're closer to the beginning of this struggle than we are to the end. And the fact that we have to go forward with burgeoning deficits, a war-weary U.S. population, and an all-volunteer force that's recovering from 14 years at war, 1.6 million post-9/11 vets that need our care, and millions of vets from previous wars that still need our care. Really puts the challenge not just on the VA, but on all of us as a country. We're going to be at this for a long time. And I find it better to think of what's happening today more in duration in terms of the Cold War than I do about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Because we're up against an adaptive enemy, and this is going to go on for a long time. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about our journey here as a military in dealing with behavioral health issues. But one of the things that struck me as I was doing this is when we started this in 2002 and 2003, we almost had to restart it as a military. Our medical corps, they knew what they were doing. But behavioral health was not ingrained in the mainstream force. And I suspect it was probably true in the Marines as well as in the Army. And so we've come an awful long way. So on September 11th, not only did the United States military have to adapt itself to a fundamentally new environment, an environment that we really hadn't dealt with as a military since Vietnam, but we had to come to grips with the human aspects of war that I honestly never had to deal with because I came in after Vietnam. And you had a generation plus of officers and non-commissioned officers who never had to deal with that. And so we had to relearn that almost from the start. Now, I will tell you that we did a lot of great training in the military, but you can't train how to deal with post-traumatic stress. No one at the National Training Center ever got post-traumatic stress. You can't create that in an environment. And so while the military was adapting from conventional war to a regular war, they were also relearning the hard-won lessons of Vietnam that had dropped out of the mainstream military. Now let me just kind of retrace my steps with behavioral health issues, because it's really almost a story of the Army just because of the positions I had. And I'll start back in 2003 when I was the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. Normal day in the Pentagon, staff comes running in first thing in the morning, hair on fire. A bunch of docs, psychiatrists had gone over to Iraq during the summer, calling themselves the mental health assessment team. And they were getting ready to release a report that said 52% of the soldiers said they had low or very low morale, and that 72% personal morale, and that 72% of the soldiers that they interviewed had low or very low unit morale. Big cause for concern. And I must admit, my first thought was, who the hell sent the shrinks to a war zone without an escort? But anyway, I gave them the benefit of the doubt, and I called them in because I wanted to hear what they had to say. What they had to say was a wake-up call for me. And really, the morale was not the big issue. I mean, when you're in the 125-degree summer heat of Iraq with poor life support because we had just got there, I can deal with the morale issues. And the fact that 80% of the men and women that they interviewed didn't exhibit any kind of behavioral health issues was a positive thing. But the wake-up call for me was how far the mainstream Army needed to come in understanding the challenges that were going to confront us as this war continued. So when I went to Iraq, I was so impressed with what these folks did that I made sure they came back every year. And they did. And the last report they did was Military Health Assessment Team number 4, and it was done done in the very difficult summer of 2006. And the results, they reported them out to me as they were leaving, but the report wasn't published till after I was the Chief of Staff. They had 4 major findings, and for this report, it was a joint report, we actually included the Marines in it. And so there were 4 key findings. And I'll share them with you because they impacted on me as I went back to be the Army chief. First of all, was the level of combat was the determining factor in the mental health status of the soldier or Marine. Second, for soldiers, deployment length and family separation were the major non-combat issues. For the Marines, this was less so because the Marines had 7-month deployments and we had 12-month deployments. And I thought to myself, we need to shorten the deployment. The third was a little troubling because for the first time, we asked them to ask questions about military ethics because we had had a couple of instances where some of our troops didn't perform according to our standards. The answers to those ethics questions were sobering. only 47% of the Army soldiers interviewed and only 38% of the Marines interviewed said that they would treat non-combatants with respect. Fortunately, great leadership and training kept a handle on that, but that was a very troubling finding, and we reacted to it with some additional training. And lastly, and another one that I took back with me as the Army chief, was that at that time the suicide rate in Iraq was higher than the suicide rate in the Army, about 11 soldiers per 100,000. It was clear to me listening to and reading this report, and this is after 3 years at war. We're dealing now with the cumulative effects of 3 years, and it was only going to get worse. Now, in retrospect, some of those findings might seem obvious and insignificant, but what it was doing was putting the leadership face to face with the human costs of war. And as I said, as I left to go back to be the Army chief, those things were heavy in my mind. So I took over as Chief of Staff of the Army in April of 2007. And of course, they back a U-Haul truck up with briefing books to brief you on this 1 million person organization with a $250 billion budget that's scattered all over the world. And as I'm going through these briefing books, two reports stood out in my mind. The first was our annual personnel survey. We do it every year, comes out every spring, asks the soldiers all kinds of questions. One of the findings was that 90% of the men and women in the Army would not seek behavioral health assistance because they thought it would harm their career. 90%. 900,000 out of a million would not. Then I saw a second report from the Surgeon General that said that we should expect that 10 to 12% of the soldiers that deploy should experience some form of post-traumatic stress in the first deployment, 15 to 17% on the second, and 17 to 19% on the third. So that the more you sent men and women back to combat, the more likely that they were going to suffer from post-traumatic stress. So at that time, we were just starting the surge. I'm thinking we're going to be doing this for 5 to 10 more years, and I'm doing the math. And the math isn't working out. I realized that if I don't do something significant, I'm not going to have enough troops. And that's a problem because the Army was already too small to get an effective deployment ratio. And the more I bored into this, the more I realized that if we were going to be successful as an Army, I was going to have to defeat the stigma of getting behavioral health care. And that was going to be a huge culture change for the Army. I mean, here you have an organization that prides itself on toughness, being tougher than Marines. I'm just seeing if you're still with me. I'm seeing. And they have an ethos that says, I'll never quit, I'll never accept defeat. And now we want them to say, hey, wait a minute, I think I need some help. I knew it was going to be a tall order, but we took it on. And by that summer, we had put together what we call a chain teaching program for the entire Army. The Surgeon General put it together. Basically, it was a package, a script that every leader had to study and then present to their subordinates. And I started it in the Pentagon with all the 4 stars sitting around a table, and I pitched it to them. And they went back and pitched it, and it went all the way down. And then we had changed the curriculum in our leader development programs for officers and non-commissioned officers to ensure that this was in the curriculum, because it wasn't. But that was just a start. We were just beginning to scratch the surface. And we kept pushing on this in 2007 and 2008, but I realized, and I'd seen it in Iraq, that if you want to change culture, you have to change the way people act. And so I needed a program that would change the way the soldiers in the Army acted. So I looked across the Army and I said to the staff, okay, I want you to show me what we're doing for behavioral health. And I want you to show it to me in 3 bins. I want you to show me our programs for assessing. I want you to show me our programs for intervening and treating. And I want you to show me our programs for preventing. Now, you already know the answers to these when you ask the questions, but I want them to know the answer. So they go out and they beaver away and they come back. And to make a long story short, we could treat you if we knew you had an issue, but our assessment processes were rudimentary at best. We had pre-deployment assessments and post-deployment assessments, but they were check-the-block things. Our training, we had kind of a rote check-the-block suicide prevention program, and we had a well-intentioned Surgeon General program called Battle Mind training that wasn't embraced across the Army. It was a good idea, but they couldn't get it out there. And so the last part was, which is what I expected, we were doing next to nothing to prevent soldiers from getting post-traumatic stress. We were putting them in these hugely demanding environments, and we weren't helping them get the coping skills to deal with those environments. Now, as a leader, I believe you owe your subordinates the tools to succeed. So the situation I found was completely unacceptable to me. So I cast a wide net. I went out to the civilian world, and I looked for the best minds in the country. And I pulled in Marty Seligman from University of Pennsylvania and Richard Carmona, who's a former Surgeon General of the United States and also happened to be a Staff Sergeant and Special Forces medic in Vietnam, and a few other folks from around the country. And we brought them into the Pentagon, and we batted this around. And we started forming some ideas. But, you know, in an organization of 1 million people, you got to figure out, okay, how are these ideas going to scale to an organization of 1 million people? Well, it took us about 9 months of work. And again, some of the best folks in the companies, in the country, weighed in on this. And we designed a program that ultimately became called Comprehensive Soldier Fitness. And it was a program that was designed to change the culture of the Army by moving mental fitness to the same level as physical fitness. I knew that if I went out and started talking about mental fitness, I'd get, as you said, the Heisman. But if I made mental fitness part of being a soldier, I had a chance. I knew it's still going to be hard, but I had a better chance. And I was going to use this program to change the way the Army acted. 4 key elements to the program: an assessment tool called the GAT, the Global Assessment Tool. It's a self-administered tool that a soldier does online in the privacy of their own room, or at basic training with the drill sergeant looking over his shoulder. It shows them their mental fitness in 5 categories: physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, and family. And it's pretty simple. Soldier answers a bunch of questions, and he gets a bar graph. You got a long bar? Have a nice day. You got a short bar? Talk to your sergeant. The second element was online self-help modules in those 5 areas. So the soldier had a short bar. He could go online and get some tips. Third, and I think this was probably the core of the program, it was the Master Resilience Training Program. You know, we had Master Fitness Training programs. So we had Master Fitness trainers. They're all buff and could do a lot of push-ups. These were the folks that knew how to teach people about how to be more resilient. And the last one was, again, we ratcheted up what we were doing in our schools. We kicked the program off 6 years ago this week, because we kicked it off at the Association of the United States Army Conference, which ended today. By 2011, when I left, almost 1 million people had taken the assessment tool, and we had 4 million Master Resilience trainers. It turned out also to be a great stigma breaker, but it wasn't easy. As I go around the Army and I talk to the colonels and the sergeants major, they all got it, or at least that's what they told me. But then when I talked to the families said, "You ain't got it, General. You have not cracked the company and platoon level, the lowest level of the Army. That's the level that hasn't gotten it yet." And so we redoubled our efforts on that and continue to work hard at it. To show you how hard it is to change culture in a big organization, after 3 years of banging it this hard while I was the Army chief. I picked up that personnel survey again in April as I was walking out the door. We had reduced the number of soldiers who would not get behavioral health assistance from 90% to 50%. And everybody started to break their arms, patting themselves on the back. I said, wait a minute, that's still 500,000 people that won't get help. We got a long way to go. I was very pleased that the Army has not only kept the program, but actually advanced it. They're now up to 20,000 master resilience trainers, and they've expanded the programs to civilians and to families. Now, I don't want you to think that's all we did during that period. I mentioned that because I believe that reducing the stigma was the most important thing I could do for the long-term health of the Army, and that's where I focused my attention. Throughout this time, we also continued to expand what we were doing for TBI and post-traumatic stress, and to deal with the suicides, which in 2008, actually, the Army rate exceeded the civilian rate for the first time in recorded memory. Took a while, but by 2010, we finally issued protocols for traumatic brain injury. When soldiers were exposed to an explosion, they had to get evaluated and they had to sit out. You see the NFL doing that now. And then we significantly revamped our suicide prevention program to a program called Health Promotion, Risk Reduction, and Suicide Prevention, and pushed that across the Army. We've come a long way as an Army and as a Department of Defense in dealing with behavioral health, but the efforts need to continue. I got about 5 more minutes. I want to talk a little bit about what I've been doing and what I've been seeing since I retired from the Army. After what I just told you about and what I saw in Iraq and as the Army chief, I knew that the impact of war was going to be with us for a long time. But it was really driven home to me in the summer after I retired. Out of nowhere, I got a call from a gentleman that lived near us in Boston, and he had been in Iraq with in Vietnam with my father, and he wanted to come down and chat. So I invited he and his wife down for coffee, and they come in and he starts talking, and about halfway through, I realized that I am part of his healing process, and he tells me that he was listening and reading some things about what the Army was doing to reduce the stigma of post-traumatic stress, of getting treatment for post-traumatic stress. And just 2 years before, he went and started his treatment, 40 years after he'd left Vietnam. When they were leaving, his wife hugged me harder than he did, and it was clear that she had been through a lot. I don't have to tell you about how important it is to take care of our veterans. But when I go around the country, I remind people that we've had an all-volunteer force for 40 years, and that doesn't happen by magic. And we need to send the right signal to future generations to ensure that we can sustain this all-volunteer force for the difficult times that we have facing us. And the right signal that we need to send them is that military service is valued and appreciated by the country. Now, I worked for the government for 41 years. A lot of you work for the government. I think we all should all agree that the government cannot do everything for our veterans. When I talk to groups of soldiers and Marines, they're all complaining about DOD this and the government that. I said, look, wait a minute. You were in the military, right? It was screwed up then, right? Yeah. You think we got better after you left? Come on. It's a huge bureaucracy. It does big things well sometimes. But the government will never deal with the individual challenges of the 22 million veterans that are out there. That will only happen with public-private partnerships like yours. And that's what it's going to take to get our men and women the care that they deserve. One of the things I try to do is stay connected with the veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, and one of the ways I do that is through a program called Ride to Recovery. It's a group that uses cycling to help soldiers heal physically and mentally. And on the long rides with these veterans, it's easy to fall into a conversation. very personal conversation. So I was riding on September 11th, 2 years ago. I was riding from Newburgh, New York to the George Washington Bridge, down the Hudson River Valley through West Point. Beautiful ride. And I'm riding with this really sharp, young specialist, Army specialist. And we go on for about 10 miles, and then he starts telling me a story. He was in Iraq. Shortly after he got there, his vehicle was hit by an improvised explosive device. Everybody else in the vehicle was killed. The same week, he lost his platoon leader and his platoon sergeant. In all, during his tour in Iraq, he lost 11 friends, good friends. He came back to the States. He struggled with the survivor's guilt. He wasn't comfortable enough to go in and get treatment. His marriage suffered. They fought. They finally separated. He told me he decided that he was going to commit suicide. Not only did he decide, he made a plan. And the plan was that he was staying downstairs in the basement of the house that he and his wife had bought while they were sorting out the finances. And he was going to go down there and he was going to take a gun and he was going to put it in his mouth and he was going to kill himself. But he realized that his 7-year-old daughter had taken to coming down every morning at 7 o'clock and saying, "Good morning, Dad." And he realized that she would be the first one to find him. So he put his plan on hold. And just by happenstance, he went on a ride to recovery ride that Memorial Day. And he met a group of men and women that had similar challenges. And they sat him down and they convinced him that he needed to get help. And he went back to his base and he immediately went in and got help. Interestingly, he told me that it still took him 4 sessions before he fully opened up to the psychiatrist. I tell you that story because physically, mentally, and emotionally strong veterans can only be good for this country. And we have to leverage the public and private wealth of this country to make sure that our veterans get the care they need so that they can be productively contribute to our society. And I'll just wrap up here with a few words about all our veterans because we owe them an awful lot. The freedoms that we and millions of people around the world enjoy aren't free. They've been bought. They've been bought with the service, the selfless service, and the sacrifice of ordinary men and women who've done extraordinary things for this country in times of great peril. And they've made this country what it is today, the greatest country on earth. So thank you for all you're doing to help veterans. I look forward to the conference tomorrow, and I look forward to continuing to figure out how we can better support the men and women who give so much to this country. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you. You all heard of Sebastian Junger? Wrote Perfect Storm, Restrepo, some great movies. I was talking with Norman earlier. He wrote an article, I think it was in, Vanity Fair, not long ago. And he talks about when he came back from Afghanistan. This is before September 11th. He'd been over there interviewing one of the folks. And he was in a subway station in New York, and he had a panic attack. And he didn't know what it was. He thought he was going crazy. And he just happened to be talking to someone, a psychiatrist, in passing, and she said, "Oh, no, it's post-traumatic stress." And he had no idea. I like to think that the work that the military has done, very publicly, I might say, on mental health and reducing the stigma, I don't know how that has filtered down across the country. I like to think that it might have loosened things up a little bit in how people talk about mental health. I don't know. It's a very tough issue. And it's, again, my experience with the Army is it's not something you can attack head on. You can't go out and say, "Hey, you need to talk about mental health. It's important." You have to tie it to something else and make it part of being a whole person and make it acceptable. And that's just hard to do. But I like to think we've made a difference. I mean, again, I mentioned the NFL. I think they're following some of those protocols that we started developing. But let's see if it carries on in some of the other things.
How do you view the comments of some national leaders who have suggested shifting veterans care from the VA system to the private sector?
My personal view is I don't think you want to completely cut it out. But I think there can be a balance to take some of the pressure off of the VA to give vouchers to go get private care. And I'll just say this. I mean, I worked for the government for 41 years. I was really frustrated as the Army chief because I couldn't generate much interest in getting people to be more efficient with the money that they had. Because what they were trying to do was spend it. Because if they didn't spend it, they lost it for next year. And it drove me crazy, frankly. And I don't know, Matt, you know better than I would. When you say government managed anything, I just know it can be managed more efficiently. But I don't think we ought to completely shut down the VA. But I think the voucher system could help out at least regionally, if not across the country, for specific areas. The only thing I would tell you is from my experience, the best way to get past the stigma is peer-to-peer interface. Just like that soldier I used in the example. He went because people just like him said, it's okay. I could tell him it was okay. His colonel could tell him it was okay. But when those people with you tell you, I do some work with an organization called Project Cohort. And they build on this idea. And what they do is they form a cohort of folks that are going into counseling. And it's sponsored by Outward Bound and the Sierra Club. And they send them out together on a Outward Bound Sierra Club adventure. And they form that cohort there. Then they go to therapy. And I think it's probably pretty helpful. The other thing we have going for us now is anybody who's been deployed, and especially been deployed a couple of times, if they're honest with themselves, they know they've been at the brink at some point. And I watched the SEALs and I watched the Delta guys. They had a program for watching each other and talking to each other about how they were doing. And they were on 4-month rotations, but the intensity of what they were doing every night was so great. When those guys start watching it, to me that was a big, and I use that example all over. Hey, if the Delta guys are doing this, you guys better get on board. Okay, drug abuse was a big problem with Vietnam veterans' mental health. How much better is it today, and what are the implications? It's much better today, largely because of the mandatory urinalysis testing that we have, and everybody knows it, and it's random, and so it's nowhere near where it was when I came in the Army in the early 70s. But one of the most important things that we found over time was that the drug abuse and the behavioral health issues and the alcohol abuse, it's all linked. And I can remember as a second lieutenant in Germany, I had this wonderful staff sergeant in my platoon. He was the best field guy going. Just came back from Vietnam. But he was an absolute total alcoholic. And over the period of about 6 months, he get drunk, miss work, and so he kept getting reduced. And looking back on it now, we never thought, we just thought it was an alcohol problem. Looking back on it now, I said, this guy had post-traumatic stress. But we weren't thinking about it in those terms. We just were dealing with a discipline problem, not with the cause. And I think we're getting more sophisticated. I wouldn't say much more sophisticated, but we're getting more sophisticated in that and linking things. At the Brain Award 2015, and you can open this up a bit later. It comes with a gift box. Thank you. And it's a plaque related to the Brain Award. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you all. Thanks for the great work that you're doing.